Hello. Thank you guys for tuning in for another video. I trust that you're glad to see me, as I'm glad to see you. Now, please forgive me for being so spiffy today. I actually have a wedding I have to attend in a bit, and I wanted to get this video out of the way before I became busy with other things. So, chances are that if you clicked on this video, you are interested in the topic of communism. Probably even the ongoing debate between capitalism versus communism, like which is preferential or which is better. This video is not going to be so much a overview or discussion of communism. More so, it's going to be primarily a discussion of a book I recently read. If you can even call it a book, it's more like a pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And several of you are probably familiar with communist literature, especially the Communist Manifesto, I think being perhaps the most famous and notorious, or depending on who you ask, infamous of communist literature. And I guess my primary motivation for making this video is I've often been intrigued by just how many different proponents there are on either side of the spectrum. That is, those who are in favor of the free market system, as well as those who are in favor of the command system economy. And the fact that seemingly the proponents on either side can agree on very little, if anything, right? And so I'm trying to come at this topic very objectively, impartially, and with an open mind. It's my personal belief that we can become so entrenched in our own beliefs and ideas that we're unable to see the fault in our ideas. And all that is to say is that I think that whether you're pro-capitalist or pro-communist, there are faults on either side. Like, neither system or ideology is perfect, right? So that being said, let's go ahead and talk about the Communist Manifesto. So initially, my expectation was by the time I finished reading the Communist Manifesto that I would have a strong or better understanding of communism, that is, communist theory. I figured that I was going to learn about communism through the lens of its founders. That is, what is communism? What is it intended to do? And how is it supposed to accomplish what it's intended to do? And don't get me wrong, the Communist Manifesto has some of that. But what I found rather was that the Communist Manifesto is primarily a critique. And that is a critique of capitalism, otherwise known as the free market system, as well as its proponents, or the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois class. Which, if you're not familiar, the bourgeoisie was basically the property-owning class of people during the time of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that is 19th century. And so these were the people who employed the working class, otherwise known as the proletariat. And these two classes are mentioned quite a bit throughout the book. One of the things that really stood out to me, like almost immediately when I began reading the manifesto, was that the language used was very passionate, very emotional, almost zealous in a way. And that's not a knock on it at all. It's just one of the things that stood out to me. It's characteristic about the work. And this sort of highlights that Marx and Engels had a lot of conviction on this subject. They had a strong sense of urgency. And I'll probably mention this a little bit later. I'll elaborate on this, but one of the things that people don't understand about communism, I find many people don't, is that it has a revolutionary character to it. I kind of already mentioned that Marx and Engels did a lot of critiquing in this book of capitalism, as well as the proponents of capitalism during their time. They were not at all interested in critiquing for the sake of reforming capitalism, for the sake of tweaking the system to make it more optimal or whatnot. No, they wanted to totally turn the system on its head and sort of basically demonstrate how unsatisfactory capitalism was, with the intention of using communism as the counter proposal. So tearing capitalism down, albeit in some legitimate ways. That is, some of the critiques they gave were legitimate, and I'll get into that in just a bit. But doing it seemingly for the purpose of uplifting communism and demonstrating how communism would be preferential or more virtuous or more desirable. All right. So the next part is a bit more difficult to elaborate on, at least for me, because I don't think that I am the most qualified. Really, I'm not qualified at all, other than the fact that I'm interested in learning more about communism and having an open discussion. The philosophical content or context. So, what I find is that a lot of people who I rub shoulders with, they're usually pro free market system. They're usually pro capitalist. And hence they're anti communist or anti command system, right? I find that there is not as much a willingness to understand why Marx and Engels believed what they believed, right? Because as I've kind of already spoke on, some of the critiques that Marx and Engels gave were legitimate. So, for example, communism, the idea is very morally motivated. It kind of starts with this moral premise that capitalism by its very nature must exploit. It must oppress people. And this is seen very prominently in 19th century capitalism, and most people will agree with me when I say this. 19th century capitalism was not desirable because there were no laws and regulations that accommodated or represented the interests of the proletariat. That's why capitalists were able to get away with things like overworking their employees, underpaying them, and even engaging in behavior which was considered normal at the time, employing children in factories, right? And so it was this environment that communism was sort of birthed out of, at least formally, right? And I think it's very important to note that. The problem is as I kind of already mentioned, Marx and Engels, rather than want to reform and critique, form and tweak the system so that it was more optimal and ideal, they instead opted for pushing this very radical, extreme, revolutionary idea, which for some people seems satisfactory. But in my opinion, I think that it is much more reasonable, much more civil to not only bring these critiques to the forefront, but also have a discussion on how those critiques can be used to improve the system that's already in place. I think that generally speaking, that leads to a much more peaceful transition in terms of attaining some sense of progress, right? And speaking of progress, this is also one of the lesser known facts about communism, and it's also mentioned explicitly in the Communist Manifesto, precisely in the preface. So a lot of people don't know this, but Darwin's On the Origin of Species had a profound influence on this idea. So you know how Darwin proposed the idea that over a long period of time, species basically through a process of natural selection progress and evolve, and that accounts for all the differences that we have in biology and all that. Marx and Engels basically used that same idea in principle, but translated it into the social sciences, precisely communism. And so it sort of assigned a scientific or evolutionary character to communism. And that's what distinguishes it from, say, a theory that supposes itself to be purely philosophical or theoretical or abstract. No, Marx and Engels believed that communism to be an inevitable, objective, empirically verifiable consequence of social science, or the progression of social science. And so the end goal of communism in Marx and Engels' opinion is to, one, abolish private or individual property, hence doing away with class distinctions, and then boom, we have peace on earth, Hakuna Matata, we have utopia. Because it is supposed, at least in what Engels calls the nucleus of Marx's idea, it is supposed that society or civilization or humanity goes through a series of epochs in history in which there are perpetual class struggles. And all this really means is that, we may go from having a struggle between the aristocracy and the peasantry, or up in Marxist time, we have a struggle between the capitalist or the bourgeois and the proletariat. It seems like throughout human history, there's always been a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, the privileged and the unprivileged. And it is the existence of private property that is to blame for this. So once we do away with private property or individual property, we do away with class distinctions, and hence people no longer have any reason to argue with each other. There's no longer any inequality, unfairness, injustice, etc., yada, yada, yada. And that, in a nutshell, is pretty much the end goal of communism. Not so much to abolish property itself, but to abolish individual property. Hence, putting all property into the hands of the state. And so the state, or the sovereign, or the government, will having ownership of all the means of production, distribute the wealth thereof accordingly as they see fit. This, in theory, is what communism is supposed to do. And I know that there's several of you who are pro-capitalist, anti-communist, who will watch this and think to yourself like, oh, well, yeah, in theory, but in practice, if you look at history, historically, canonically, the successors of Marx and Engels, those who actually implemented communism, can be argued to have had very disastrous effects in their own nations and economies. And so I will leave the viewer, or the listener in this case, I will leave you to be the judge of whether communism has potential or whether it does not. But anyways, I'm really interested in exploring this topic more. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. If you have any likes, dislikes, comments, critiques, questions, etc., please leave them in the comment section down below. Hope that all of this made sense. And yeah, look forward to some more banging content. Until next time, bye-bye.